here's what I want you to do. Right out of the gate, grab your Bibles, open them up to the book of Psalms, okay? Psalm chapter 90 is where I want you to be. Just lay it in your lap. And you might be here and you're like, I don't have a Bible. Take one out of the chairs, okay? And if you don't own a Bible, just take that one with you. Put your name in it. It's our gift to you, okay? If you don't have a newer version of the Bible, take that one. When you get to the Bible, you'll see it's two parts. It's separated in two parts. There's an Old Testament and a New Testament. Psalms is in the first part, which is the Old Testament, and it's probably the biggest book. So you flip through it enough, you'll hit Psalms. Go to chapter 90, just lay it in your lap, and we're going to look at what Psalm 90 has to say because we're in a series called Simplify, all right? And here's what we've been saying. Simplify, by the way, is the name of a book that a guy named Bill Hybels wrote, and he has some great things to say that pertain to even what we're talking about some. But here's what we've been saying in this series so far. We said it doesn't take long for our simple lives with our simple goals to all of a sudden get really, really cluttered and complex and downright complicated, right? And I know that to be true because I'm going to tell you something. I've been talking to people all morning, and last week I talked to people all Sunday that said, hey man, this is for me, right? Doesn't take long. Simple lives get really, really complicated to get complex. And here's how this happens. We said the reason our lives get complicated and complex is because our lives are kind of like a juggling act, and we start juggling life and our schedules and our finances and kids and whatever and whatnot. But here's what our culture tells us. Our culture says this. There's all these options that you can partake in, and the operating wisdom in our culture is the more you experience, the more you have, the more you take in, the happier you're going to be. That's kind of what our culture says. And so, man, we kind of buy it. We're like, okay, we're going to throw some more things in there. And all of a sudden, we just start juggling all these balls in the air that represent our schedule, our finance, whatever it is. And we start juggling all this stuff. And before long, the things that we thought were going to bring us happiness, all of a sudden exhaust us, overwhelm us, depress us, disappoint us. And just keeping all those balls in the air kind of stress us out, right? And all of a sudden, it gets really complicated. It's like, wow, how did I get here? How did this happen to me? This morning, I want to talk to you about what I think is a very relevant area in which many of us struggle to simplify, and that is the area of our time. Our time. Now, here's what I want to tell you before I jump into what I want to share with you. This is an area that I personally have battled over and over and over and over again. Okay? So I'm not going to stand up here and teach you as somebody who has mastered this. In fact, I am very indebted to people like Chad Moore, Tim Keller, Andy Stanley, others that I've had the chance to read their writings and listen to what Bill Hybels was in his book. And here's what I want to do this morning. We do this for a minute. I want to teach you as I've been taught and am being taught. Is that fair? I want to lead you as I've been led and am being led. Is that fair? And I think this is a very, very important thing for us to talk about because when you really stop and you think about life, here's the deal. Just think about this. Your life is your time, and your time is your life. Let us sink in for a minute. Your life is your time, and your time is your life. And what you do with your time, think about it, is what you end up doing with your life. But lest you just agree with me, it's deeper than that. Because what you do with your time isn't what you just do with your life, but what you do with your time is very significant because it doesn't just result in what you do, but it also has a lot to say about who you become. What you do with your time has a lot to say about who you become. And you already know what I'm getting ready to say. I already know you know this, but let's just say it for the sake of saying it. There's 3 things you can do with your life. Therefore, 3 things you can do with your time. You know what they are? You can waste your time. You can waste your life. Eat, drink, for tomorrow we die, right? Let's party, right? I can waste my life. Or I can spend my life, right? It's kind of the American dream way of doing it, right? I can spend my time trying to get ahead. I can spend my time trying to get richer. I can spend my time trying to make a name for myself. I can spend my time trying to become significant. I can spend my time fill in the blank. I can waste my life. I can spend my life, therefore spend my time. Or I think God gives us another option, and that is I can invest my life. I can invest my time in something that's going to outlast it. And here's what I'm pretty sure about, that God's the one who gifts us with our life, therefore He gifts us with our time. And I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure you'd agree with me, that he gifted us with this thing called time, not so that we could waste it, not so that we could simply spend it, but so that we might invest it, right? But here's the problem, because you're no different than me. I'm sure of it. You're no different than me. Unfortunately, for many of us, if not most of us, maybe all of us, I don't know, many of us in the room, we're too busy doing life to think about our life. Many of us in the room, we don't have time to think about how we invest our time because we're busy. We got people to see, places to go, things to do. And I know I'm not speaking to people who don't understand because all morning people are like, yeah, this resonates. And you can hear it in your conversation. Hey, man, how you doing today? Hey, I'm doing, oh, man, it's so busy, man. It's been a packed week. I'm having trouble keeping up. You know how the conversation goes. Or, hey, I'm planning on coming, but I might be a little bit late. Or, I'll be there, but I got to leave early, right? I mean, you can hear our busyness in our conversation. It just soaks through our words. And here's what happens. We become slaves all of a sudden to our schedules. That's what happens. You see, I remember when this hit the wall for me. I remember when I woke up, I'm like, what just happened here? I told you last week, before we lived here, we planted a church in Indiana, and we were there for 14 years. And as that church started to grow near Fort Wayne, Indiana, it was really cool because all of a sudden we saw God just blowing the doors off. It was incredible. And so I was busy because I had meetings, right? My schedule was packed. I had places to go, people to see, things to do. We had big dreams to fulfill, all this kind of stuff. And I was flying from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting because I felt tons of responsibility. I was the leader of what was going on and this, that, and the other thing. And I'll never forget the day that I was running out the living room door on my way to a meeting because it was next on my schedule. And there on the couch was my wife with her 2 very small children that happened to be mine as well. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, hey, Dan. Yeah. Kind of like, hurry up, I got a meeting. She said, I was just curious, and she did not say this mean, by the way. My wife, if you know my wife, I don't think she's in here, but if you know my wife, she's not a mean person. She just said this. She said, I was curious if I might be able to schedule an appointment with you next week. Can you imagine what my heart did at that minute? When all of a sudden I knew I was a slave to my agenda, slave to my schedule, and I was running right past the people and the things that mattered the most to me in my life. I realized at that point that I had become a slave to my schedule and that I needed help in understanding my time. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want you to join me, okay? And I don't want to give you, okay, I'm going to relieve you a little bit. I'm not giving you a time management plan. You can go read a lot. There's good books on that. You can read that. You don't need a time management plan this morning. We need a new time management perspective. It's different. We need a different perspective. You say, Dan, what do you mean? Here's what I mean. Life looks different when you change seats. You're saying, Dan, help me understand where you're going here. Let me explain it this way. When my wife and I were young married, my wife had a hobby that she loved. She did it, and she did it all the time, and it was this cross stitch, okay? And I heard that it's not just a woman's thing. Some guy after the last service said, I do that too, so women, men do it, whatever. I've never done it. But newly married, she's sitting over there, and she's doing what you do when you cross stitch. She's whatever they do when they cross stitch. She's doing that over there, and she's sitting over there, and she loved it, right? She was enthusiastic about it. She'd be talking to herself about her cross stitch, oh, this is incredible. And I'm watching her, I'm like, this is nuts. What is she doing? Because from my perspective, I'm watching her do this. I'm sitting over here, and all I could see was the back of this canvas where there was these disjointed strings of thread and whatever and whatnot. And I'm like, why is she so excited about that? It wasn't until I got up and I came over here and I sat beside her and I was able to look over her shoulder and I'm like, oh, wow, there's a picture coming out here, right? And that's really cool. And then I was able to look at what was beside her, and that's what you're doing. And that's what it's going to become. And all of a sudden, my perspective changed. Why is that important? Because this morning, I want to take you from sitting here, and I want to allow you, it's not my invitation, it's a guy named Moses, by the way, to sit over here on the couch and listen, I want you to peek over God's shoulder and see if it doesn't change the way you look at your time, and therefore change the way you look at your life. You see, you have your Bibles open to Psalm 90, and what may be surprising to you is David's not the guy that wrote this. The psalm in front of you is written by Moses. We don't think of Moses writing Psalms, right? Or like David was the guy who wrote something. No, Moses wrote this psalm. And I can't think of anybody more credible to talk to us about time than Moses. You know why? Moses lived to be, you know how old he was? He lived to be 120. He lived longer than most of us are going to live, right? He lived to be 120, and you could split his life into 3 chapters, each of 40 years. You read his story, you can. The first 40 years of Moses' life, he lived in the Egyptian palace, right? And the reason he got to that Egyptian palace was the Pharaoh, Egyptian Pharaoh, was killing all the Hebrew baby boys. Moses' mom hid him in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter goes down to the Nile River where he's hidden in this basket. She finds this baby and she says, I want this baby. And so she takes Moses and he grows up in the palace. He has this incredible life with all the accommodations and the learning and so on and so forth. In Egypt, it's incredible, right? Until one day, he's out walking around and he sees one of his brothers, a Hebrew slave, being mistreated by one of the Egyptians. He takes matters into his own hands and kills the Egyptian. All of a sudden, he goes from this life with all these accommodations to being a fugitive on the run. And the next chapter of Moses' life, next 40 years, you can read about it in the Bible, by the way. You can read about it. He becomes this obscure shepherd. Think about it. He has this life where he has everything at his fingertips, and all of a sudden he's in the middle of the desert, and every day he wakes up to the bleating of sheep, and he goes to bed to the sheep just going bah, bah, and he's thinking to himself, is this my life? Because for 40 years, I didn't say 40 days, not 40 weeks, not 40 months, 40 years, that's what his life is. He's this obscure shepherd, and here, you got to read your Bible this way. He doesn't know how it's going to end. He don't know how it's going to end. He doesn't know the final chapter of his life. He doesn't know the impact of his life. He doesn't know if his life's going to have any significance. He doesn't know Charlton Heston's going to play him someday in a movie. He doesn't know all that stuff. He's just out there waking up with the sheep, going to bed with the sheep, and they're like, hey, this is what a shepherd does, until one day a bush catches on fire, and God chooses this crazy way to say, hey, I want to talk to you because I got another assignment for you. What's that? I want you to go back to Egypt. You, what? And Moses wasn't real keen on the idea at first, but eventually God says, I want you to go back and look at Pharaoh and say, let my people go. They were slaves. Moses, albeit reluctant, goes back. Remember the story? 10 plagues, all that stuff? You probably send Prince of Egypt, that kind of thing, right? He goes back, and all of a sudden he leads over 1 million people, probably, out of Egypt. I mean, it's this incredible mass of people. Scholars have different numbers, but he leads them out of Egypt, and they begin for the next 40 years, I didn't say 40 days, not weeks, not months, 40 years, he leads these people through the desert. And I wonder sometimes if he didn't wish he was back with the sheep. Because if you read the story, these people were complainers, they were whiners, they were negative, they were what if and what. And God says, I want you to lead them. And for 40 years, he leads these people. And he gets right to the brink of this promised land. And God lets him in on the fact that you're not going to be able to go into the land, but I'll let you get a peek at it. And he takes him up on a mountain and he says, that's the land they're going to eventually go into. Listen, I don't know what your story's like, but when I read about Moses, like, he probably understands whatever you're facing, right? I mean, he probably understands if you're here today and you're like, my life and my time is just kind of this life of obscurity. Or my life is full of disappointment, I think Moses has a pretty good perspective on time and life and real experiences, right? And disappointment. And here's what Moses does. You with me? Pretend he's here today. He says, come here. I want you to pray with me, because that's what Psalm 90 is. And as you pray with me, it's the opportunity for you to peek over God's shoulder, and you see if the God that I'm talking to, when you have the chance to peek over his shoulder, doesn't change the way you see your time. So here's what he says, Psalm 90. You with me? You can follow on the screens in your Bibles. He said, Moses is praying. He says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, which is a cool way to say it, or you brought forth the whole world, before you created everything that is, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Stop a minute. Look up here a second. What's he saying? He's saying, God, the God I'm talking to, you transcend time. You stand outside of time. God, you are forever. You are eternal. What he's saying is, pretend for a minute this stage represents time as we know it. So there are some of you, and I would fall in this category, who think that the earth is a little younger, right? So you think maybe the earth has been around for 7,000 to 10,000 years. So assume this represents 7,000 to 10,000 years. There are others of you who think it's been around for billions and billions of years, and that's cool. Just assume that this stage represents whatever you think the timeline is, okay? We're not going to argue about that. Just assume that. What Moses is saying is, whatever that is for you, God, you exist forever that way and forever that way. God, the God whose shoulder you get to look over, he's big, he's bigger than you thought, and he is a God who transcends time. Now, if that doesn't blow your mind, maybe you're not awake and with me. But here's the deal. Because some of you are like, I'm not sure I buy this God thing. And Dan, are you telling me really? I mean, forever? I mean, and here's the question I get, and you may have this question. Well, when did God begin? And I think Moses is saying, wrong question. God forever was and will be. And you're like, okay, I have a hard time getting my head around that, Dan. Well, here's what I'm going to tell you, and then we'll move on. It's not the purpose of today's message. But even if you doubt and are skeptical about God, and this really throws you for a loop, you believe something existed in eternity. Because somewhere you felt like that little dust mite that eventually caused everything to be brought into existence existed somewhere. Something created that. Something made that exist. And so whatever that is, Moses is saying, I can tell you it's not an it is a who, and that is God, and he transcends time, and we get to peek over his shoulder, and then he says this, you turn people back to dust. Saying, return to dust, you mortals. That's a fascinating statement. And then he says, when you peek over this God's shoulder, 1,000 years in your sight, God, are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. He's saying, if you and I can peek over God's shoulder, time looks different. He's a big God. He's an eternal God. And he says, this God who, when we peek over his shoulder, time looks way different. 1,000 years on this stage looks like a day, or even a watch in the night, several hours in the night. That's what he's saying. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They're like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. What's he saying? He said time looks different, and he says our life looks different. Because he says our life goes by quick. That's what he's saying. It's like grass that comes up in the morning, bam, gone at night. Basically what he's saying, because I've talked to some of you are country western fans, you like country music. He's saying Kenny Chesney's song, the old one, Don't Blink, is true. He says you blink and bam, you blink and bam, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, I'm at the end. Some of you in the room, and I'm not being funny by this, who are older, you understand this. And if you could stand up here in my place, and maybe you should, you would say to those of us younger, listen to me, time goes by fast. Moses knew what he was talking about. Then he says, verse 7, check this out. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. Here's what he's saying. He says, God's big, he's eternal. Time looks different. And then he says this. He says, I can't hide something from this God. I'm not going to be able to hide something from this God. And then he says this, all our days pass under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Check this out. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. That's fascinating. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they pass quickly and we fly away. How many of you grew up going to church camp or somewhere where they sang, I'll fly away, oh glory. You know that song? You wonder where it came from? Right here, Psalm 90. We fly away then. If only we knew the power of your anger, your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Here's the way Andy Stanley describes that particular part of this passage. He said, if you and I could really see God for who he is, we would give him the reverence that he's due in our lives. In other words, he's saying our perspective changes everything. When you and I come over here behind this God's shoulder and we begin to look at our life and our time, everything changes. And all that he's just said in verses 1 through 11 lead up to a very popular verse that most of you, many of you maybe have heard because you see it on plaques, on cards. And here's what he says, verse 12. It's all leading to verse 12. He says, so in light of all that, teach us to what? Number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. He's saying, in light of the fact that when we come over here and look at life over God's shoulder, this eternal God's shoulders, and he sees 1,000 years like one day, and my life is like here and then gone, then God, in light of all that, would you teach me to count my days, to number my days, because obviously my days are numbered, so that I might have a heart of wisdom, and that with that heart of wisdom I might live wisely. Here's one point today, and that's all, one point. And here it is. Moses is trying to tell us my time is limited. So I must limit how I invest my time. My time and your time is limited, so we must limit how we invest our time. He's saying, teach me to number my days. When I look at life, my life from over God's shoulders, okay, God, teach me then to see my life in the right perspective so that I might have a heart of wisdom, so that I might invest my life wisely. Here's the deal. Don't make this too complicated. You already know how to count your days. You already know how to number your days. You're saying, Dan, how do I know? Well, here's how I know you know. Because a lot of you have already done it. You're saying, what do you mean by that? Well, raise your hand if you've ever been married in the room. Just raise your hand. Guarantee you counted your days because you knew exactly how many days it was to your wedding. And you knew everything that needed to be done from this day to this day. And you're like, we got 52 days till this. And so you started counting your days so that you could wisely plan, right? Some of you in the room, how many of you in the room have ever had a baby? Just raise your hand, you know. Some guys were raising their hand. They're like, bam, you've never had no, you know, whatever. But you forgive him, okay? He was there. But anyways, you know how to number your days. I got some of you in trouble because you knew when the baby was coming. You knew this is what needs to happen, and you get the room ready and whatever. You know, right? How many of you, but you don't have to raise your hand, how many of you are retired? You know how to number your days. You know exactly how many days, and I need to prepare. How many of you ever graduated? You know how to number your days. That's what he's saying. He says, I want, with looking at life over this eternal God's perspective and the way he sees time, okay, therefore, I don't want to just flippantly go through my life. I don't want to just randomly go through my life, but teach me to see my life over his shoulder so that I can number my days, because my days are numbered, so that I might wisely invest my time, because my time is my life. And what I do with my time is what I'll do with my life. And what I do with my life eventually will have a lot to say about who I become. And I think what Moses is saying, stay with me on this, he's saying that if you and I could see that our time, our schedules against the backdrop of this eternal God, if we could peek over his shoulder and how he sees it, we would see our time way different. All of a sudden, we would see our lives are relatively short against the backdrop of how he sees time. Our lives are relatively short. Literally, our lives are a sliver on this timeline called this stage, right? But they're a sliver on the timeline of history, and they're a blip on the radar of eternity. I think if we could peek over God's shoulder, we say, hey, this is just a warm-up for eternity. These 70 or 80 years here are nothing compared to eternity. I think if we could peek over his shoulder, you know what? I think we would see the things that we think we own, they're really on loan, right? I think that's what we'd see. And you know what? Stay with me on this. I think if we could peek over God's shoulder, it would change what we said yes to, and I think it would change what we said no to. Because saying no can be really, really hard. Saying no can be really, really hard. And the reason it can be really, really hard is this, is we don't want to disappoint anybody. And we want everybody who asks us to be involved or to help or to participate to think that they're as important as the next person and that everything is important. Yet I want to throw a quote up here that you ought to let rattle around in your brains by Patrick Lencioni. He says, if everything is important, well then nothing is important. If everything matters to me, well then nothing matters. It's a fascinating quote. I think Moses' point would be this, that if you and I, listen to this, could look at our life over God's shoulders, I would realize, you ready? I'd realize that when I say no, it is my most emphatic way to say yes to the most important things. When I say no to some things, it is the most emphatic way in which I say yes to other things. Let me illustrate, because I've not always been good at this. I really haven't. I remember when I first came here as a pastor. It's about 6.5 years ago. New pastor, a new place, right? all these new people you're meeting. And so you want to make a good impression, right? You want them to love you and like you and this, that, and the other thing. And so people are saying, hey, can you this and we this and that and the other thing. And I'll never forget the Sunday, a guy came up to me, and there is something that goes on all the time around here on a Saturday morning. Now, you may not know this. There's no reason for you to know this. But my schedule, the way it rolls out, I take one day off a week, and that one day I take off a week is Saturday. Saturday is my one day off a week. And so this guy was saying, hey, you're the pastor here, and this is going on. I assume I'll see you. And I said, well, I wasn't planning on coming. And he kind of looked at me and was like, well, you're the pastor. You should be there. Oh, I said, why should I be there? Well, because it's happening, and this is what this, that, and he's going all these reasons. And I remember I felt this pressure. It's like, I don't want to disappoint this dude, you know. I'm pretty new here. And I remember looking at him. There's this moment, this awkward moment. And I feel like God gave me the courage. I looked at him, and I said, I'm not coming. And I took it one step further. And I said, can I just tell you something? I'm never coming. He kind of looked at me. He was a little offended at first. Some of you are thinking, I'm surprised you're still the pastor here, right? I said, I'm never coming. He said, why are you never coming? I said, because I take Saturday off, and every Saturday morning around 10 or 10:30, we gather around my table, and my family is there. And so me saying no to you is me saying yes to Joel, me saying yes to Rachel, me saying yes to Aaron, me saying yes to Jennifer, me saying yes to Mary Jane. That's what it is. You see, your no can be your most emphatic yes to the things that really matter. Can I tell you something? I don't regret it for 1 minute. I don't regret it for 1 minute. I got asked to do a speaking engagement this summer, later in the summer. Can I tell you something? They ask you to do that, and they're like, hey, we want you to come talk about something I'm very passionate about. Like I got excited when I saw the topic, and they want to hear some things that you can help these people out and whatever and whatnot. And man, you get this speaking, and you're like, wow, I want to go and be a part of this. But I have a daughter who's a senior in high school, and she's going to be going away to college, and she's in this transition of life. And it's pretty close to the time we're going to be saying goodbye to her, and everything begins to change at that point. And I was met with a choice, just like you are. And I thought I could say yes to them, and I think I'd say no to her. And so I told my wife, I said, I think I need to say no. I'd love to go speak on what they're speaking about, but I would rather say yes to my daughter. You see how that works? You see, when you say no, it may be the most emphatic yes you say to the people and the things that matter the most. And I think if I could see my life over God's shoulder, I'd realize the importance of saying yes to the things that are really, really important. Listen close, instead of allowing other people, everybody around me, to tell me what I should say yes to. I don't know if there's a struggle for anybody else, but there's a New Testament writer who lets us peek over God's shoulder. You don't need to turn there. We'll throw it up here. Here's what he says. Just check this out. He says, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. What he's saying is this guy could have lived in our culture. He's saying his life sounds kind of busy. And so he's saying what you already know, our lives fill up fast, but they're not always fulfilling, right? So our lives are very full, but they're not always fulfilling to us, and then we get busy quick. And then he says this. He says, well, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. You know what he's saying there? Life's unpredictable. I know this about not a single one of you, no matter what's on your schedule, know what's exactly going to happen tomorrow. Nobody wakes up any day thinking this is a great day for a bad day. Nobody wakes up and says, hey, I think it'd be a great day for a crisis, a great day for the doctor to tell me my health's bad, a great day for my boss to let me go. Nobody does that. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? And then he says, what is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. You know what he's saying there? He's saying your life goes by quick. It's like the morning fog. It's here and then it's gone. And he says, when you realize that and peek at your life over God's shoulder, it changes the conversation. That's how you ought to remember it. It changes the conversation. Instead of telling God what you're going to do, you see, that's how we approach life. We fill our schedules. I got all this busy nut, and here's how it works. God, would you bless this? So that's how it works. We spiritualize it. We make it sound spiritual, right? It's like, God, I'm so busy, and God, would you bless this? I'm like, we wear busyness like a badge of honor. Let's just be honest, right? It's like this badge of honor. Oh, man, they're so busy. They're doing it. And we're like, God, bless all this. He said, instead of that, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is you boast in your arrogant schemes, all such boasting is evil. He's saying, when I come over here look over God's shoulder, instead of telling God all the stuff I'm doing and asking him to bless it, I'm like saying, God, what is it you want me to do with the sliver of time called my life? Because my time is limited and I have a limited amount of things that I can invest my life in. What do you want me to do? You see the difference? Changes the conversation, guys. And then he says something in verse 17. If you write in your Bibles, I'd circle this. He says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, for him it is sin. Our definition of sin is all the bad stuff we shouldn't do, and what James says is this, is that equally so is all of the good stuff I know I should do and never get around to doing. In other words, he's saying it's a sin to have good intentions, knowing what you ought to do, and never putting those good intentions into action. Moses says, teach me to number my days that I may gain a heart of wisdom. James says, if you know the good you ought to do, then don't leave it undone. So this morning, I want to give each of you a gift, no matter how old you are. I want to give you a gift. And here's the gift. You ready? I want you to dial in for these last 5 minutes. I want to fast forward your life. I want to fast forward your life to the last 3 to 12 weeks of your life. Some of you are young and you're like, oh, stay with me. Just let me give you this gift. And I want to give you the gift through the story that I read of a lady named Bronnie Ware. The reason I want to tell you her story is she's a palliative care nurse. And so for years and years and years, she's dealt with patients during the last 3 to 12 weeks of their life. They literally are staring death in the face. And here's what she said. She said, people grow a lot when they face their own mortality. She said, I learned never to underestimate somebody's capacity to grow at that time. Their emotions vary from anger to sadness to disappointment. But one of the things that she began to document over her many years as a nurse was the regrets that people had at that point in time in their life. And so it's a gift for us that she wrote them down. And she listed for us the top 5 regrets of people at that stage of life. I'm going to give them to you in reverse order. You ought to write them down. They're worth it. She said number 5 regret that people had at that point in time in their life was, I wish that I had let myself be happier. This is fascinating to me. She said this was a surprisingly common one. Many did not realize until the end that happiness was a choice. So they stayed stuck in old patterns and habits. The so-called comfort of familiarity overflowed into their emotions as well as their physical lives. Fear of change had them pretending to themselves and everybody else that they were content. Yet what they longed for deep in, listen to this, deep inside themselves, is to be able to laugh appropriately. Can I ask you a question? We're just going to get practical for a second. If this is your first time here, we just want to talk honest. When's the last time you laughed so hard that you cried? When's the last time you or the bunch of people, you laughed so hard your stomach hurt? I think what she's saying is all these people she documented said, I just wish that I had chose to enjoy life. I chose happiness. I wish I could laugh till it hurt. Number 4, people said this over and over again, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. She wrote, often they would not truly realize the full benefits of old friends until their dying weeks, and it was not always possible to track them down. Many had become so caught up in their own lives that they had let friendships slip by over the years. There were many deep regrets about not giving friendships the time and effort they deserved. And here's what she wrote. Listen to this. This is fascinating. Everyone misses their friends when they're dying. It all comes down to love and relationships in the end. Can I ask you this? When's the last time you've connected with and communicated with friends, both new and old friends? I don't have, Dan, I already know what you're saying because it's what I say. I don't have time, right? I just don't have time to do that. If you would allow yourself to fast forward to this stage of your life, here's what she is letting us see. This is what will be important to you. This is what it'll boil down to and what will matter. I don't know what all is floating around in your brain. You're probably thinking about what you got to do after we're done here. And what she is saying is that on their deathbed, I wish I had kept in touch with my old friends. Number 3, They said, I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. She wrote, many people suppress their feelings in order to keep peace with others. As a result, they settled for a mediocre existence and never became who they were truly capable of becoming. And then she wrote this is powerful. Many of the people I nursed developed illness relating to the bitterness and resentment they carried as a result. Fascinating, isn't it? It's fascinating. Some of you maybe are thinking, hey, I'll finally come to peace when that person dies, when this person dies, if they just get out of my life, if they just move on. She's fast forwarding and she's saying, I wish that I had dealt with integrity with the things that I'm feeling. Number 2, this shouldn't surprise you. I wish I didn't work so hard. Is there any workaholics in the room? You don't need to raise your hand. But can I tell you something? We'd get along. We'd get along. It's not a bad thing. My daddy, one of the things he gave me, he taught me a good work ethic. I don't hire lazy people. Won't. Ask the staff. Hard work, good thing. But if you're here and you're a workaholic, you have that gene, you know what it's like to get on that treadmill, and then you got to put in that little extra hour, you got to put in a little extra time, you got to keep moving, I got to put in a little overtime because I might not make it. But we're not sure what it is. I might not get ahead, but we're not sure who we're trying to get ahead of. And all of a sudden, we get ourselves on a treadmill. She writes this. This came from every. Did I say every? I meant every. If you couldn't hear me, I said every. One more time, every male patient she nursed. Came from every male patient she nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. She said women spoke of this as well. But I nursed an older generation, and many of the female patients had not been the breadwinners. But all of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much of their lives on the treadmill of a work existence. By simplifying your lifestyle and making conscious choices, she writes, along the way, it's possible to not need the income you thought you needed. And by creating more space in your life, to realize happiness and a freedom that you begin to enjoy. Now, before I give you number 1, before I put it up there, teenagers, there's some of you in the room, young adults, college students, I see some over here. I really want you to dial in now because this was surprising to me, but man, this is so significant. If you'll dial in, I want to talk to you for a second. It applies to all of us. Number 1 is this. I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. She says, and then I want to explain, this was the most common regret of all. When people realize their life is almost over and look back clearly on it, it's easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. Most people had not honored even half of their dreams and had to die knowing it was due to choices they made or didn't make. From the moment you lose your health, it's too late. Health brings, listen to this, health brings a freedom very few realize until they no longer have it. Young adults, teenagers, here's how this works. You are already in the throes of this because you find yourself trying to live a life that others expect of you. It's called peer pressure. Or maybe it's parental pressure. You got to be successful and get a house with a white picket fence and this kind of income and whatever. And some of you, just let me give you this gift. Some of you in the room, you're Christ followers and you're pretty sure that God has you on a path. And that he wants you to do something that if you said it out loud in our culture among your peers, they'd be like, you're crazy. That's not what success is. That's not what it means. I mean, you're never going to get the white picket fence in the house. And you are struggling with the courage to do what you know God wants you to do. And here's what I want to tell you. I want to tell you this, okay? What she's doing for us is fast forwarding to that moment when you stare your mortality in the face. And you know what you're not going to be asking? You're not going to be asking, I wonder if I met their expectations. You're going to be asking, did I have the courage to do what I knew he wanted me to do? That's what you're going to be asking. You see, what a gift to be able to fast forward your life and all of a sudden realize these are the things that probably are going to matter, which is why Moses said, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Because my time is limited. And so I need to limit how I invest my time. Can I ask you a couple questions? I'm going to invite Aiden out. Please don't put your stuff away right now. I don't want to distract this moment. I just want to ask you a couple questions. Can I ask you this morning how you're spending or investing your life? Can I ask you this morning, when you look at your time, which is your life, what are the things that you find yourself busy doing? Would you be doing those things if you allowed yourself to look at your life from over His shoulder? What is it that you're doing that makes a difference for eternity? Maybe a better way to put it is this. When you look at what you're doing, what do you think it is leading you to become? Your time is your life, and your life is your time, and your time is limited. Can I ask you this? Who would you be saying yes to if you just started today to say no to some things in your life? Chances are I'm no different than you, and you have been unintentionally saying no to things that matter most because you haven't wanted to disappoint a bunch of other people. Or because you thought, man, if I just get busy doing a bunch of things, and you've said no. Maybe it's Jesus. Maybe it's been a long time since you've spent any time with Jesus. Maybe it's your kids, maybe it's your wife, maybe, I don't know. But maybe there's somebody in your life that you're unintentionally saying no to because you're saying yes to everything under the sun. You got 15, 11 different hobbies. You got all kinds of clubs. You're the president of this board. You're in this committee. Who is it that you're saying no to by saying yes to everything? I'm kind of curious. If you could peek at your life over His shoulder, you with me? What do you think you would want to add to your life when you looked at your life that way? You're saying, Dan, what do you mean? Well, when you look at life over the shoulder of the eternal God, what are things that you're like, I think I'd add that. It's not part of my life. Some of you are in the room, and if I'm just being frank, you don't even believe in this God I'm talking about, and that's okay because you can come here and this is cool and we can have conversation. I love the fact that you're here. But you're curious about this God we talk about, and so I want to look at you and say this. Well, it seems like trying to figure out what you think about this God is pretty important. That seems to be a pretty important thing, right? What would it mean for you to add for the next 10 weeks beginning January 28th? We have this thing called starting points, and it's just this honest conversation for people who believe there's a God, people who don't believe there's a God, and say, okay, what's the Bible say about this, and how can I get my hands around it? 10 hours, 10 weeks, 10 hours. That's all it is. 10 hours of your life seems like something to add to your life that's pretty important over the scheme of things. Some of your marriage is a wreck, and you're like, I'm too busy to work on it. I'm too busy to talk to somebody about it. Really? Because when you peek over His shoulder, it's like, maybe that's like where I should invest my time. Maybe setting up counseling is where I should invest my time. Maybe setting up seminars where I should invest my time. Can I get really personal? And not everybody's going to like it, but it is. What about church? Seriously, what about church? We live in a culture where church is kind of a coin flip sometimes, right? It's like, well, this week maybe, this week, no, I don't know, don't feel. It seems like if this is where we're talking about God and worshiping God, like that's kind of an important thing when you look over His shoulder. It's like, well, what if I made that part of my schedule? Like, I'm going to go and gather with other people as we worship God and learn about God. What do you need to add to your schedule? What do you need to subtract? You look over His shoulder, what do you think you need to subtract? Do you find areas in your life you're wasting time? Is there things that are detrimental? Are there relationships that you have that are totally sabotaging your marriage, totally sabotaging your family, totally sabotaging your relationship with Jesus? Maybe that needs to be subtracted. I don't know, but as you look over His shoulder and He says, listen, it's like grass in the morning gone. What is it with your limited time that maybe needs to go? Because it's just sucking the life out of you. Maybe another way to look at it is what do you need maybe more of in your schedule? You already have some of it in your schedule, but you know if that you turned that dial in your life, that it would benefit you. It would bring blessing to you. You'd be able to hear the voice of God in a different way maybe if you just turned that dial. Maybe it's spending time, FaceTime with Jesus. Maybe it's being in a grace group and actually going to it and being around others that are talking about what we talk about in here. I don't know, but what is it in your life that if you look over his shoulder, it's like, I'd probably ought to turn that dial up a little bit. Which leads to the last question. What is it in your schedule you think, it's not like bad and evil, but I probably could use to turn that back some? We all have it, and I shared this the last 2 services, and there were some people who didn't like it. They were kidding with me. But I said this, I've been a pastor for over 20 years, and I've not met one person, not one person, not one person who has ever improved their life by watching more TV. I haven't. And I like watching TV. I'm not saying anything's wrong. But I wonder if I look over the shoulder of that God, if even how much I watch TV is something that if I dialed it back, all of a sudden I had time for conversation with my daughter. I had time for conversation with my son. I had time to write that letter. I had time to visit that person. I wonder if I dialed that back. Here's the deal. Some of us can get in a schedule. We know our schedule by what's playing Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and there's nothing wrong with some of it. But what would happen if you dialed that back some? What would happen if all of a sudden that became a little lesser so that you could look at your life and say, wow, here's this eternal God that's given me this gift and my time is limited. Therefore, I got to limit how I invest my time. And I don't want the end of my time to simply be consumed with the shows that I watched. I want to somehow invest in something that's going to outlast me. So God, here we are. We all would love to simply peek over your shoulder and allow you to challenge us, to change us. And so we're just saying, you show us what to add, you show us what to subtract, you show us what to dial in and what to dial out. But God, help us to stay on the couch. We need you to help us to see our limited time from your perspective. We pray this in Jesus' name.